Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our second topic for this week in World Civilizations 2. As you might expect, we're going to continue looking at the Cold War conflicts, looking today specifically at conflicts in the Middle East. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into our key terms for the day. We're going to look at the Iranian Revolution. We're going to look at the Iranian hostage crisis. We'll look at the Iran-Iraq War. We'll look at the 1973 oil crisis, and we'll look at the Soviet-Afghan War. So again, very simple and straightforward. Should be a relatively short one for you this week, since last topic took up quite a bit of time. In the meantime, once again, you do of course have some assignments coming up the next couple of weeks. Won't spend much time on them since I already talked about them in our last video for this week. But again, if you have any questions, please feel free to jump in the office hours or email me whenever you get a chance. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and jump right into the thick of things. First, we're going to look at the Cold War in the Middle East, specifically in Iran. The Cold War conflicts of Iran can be traced back to August 15th of 1953. This is when the United States and the United Kingdom supported the overthrow of the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, in favor of strengthening the former monarchy and supporting the former monarchy in the country. This was known as Operation Ajax. By 1979, individuals who were upset with this turn of events started the Iranian Revolution. This is when an individual known as Grand Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, which I'm probably butchering that pronunciation, overthrew the US-backed monarchy and established an Islamic Republic. Interestingly, this was a non-violent revolution mostly, which was a bit unique for revolutions going on at the time, and it occurred in a relatively prosperous country. Now, why would an event like this seem like such a threat to the West and Western powers, do you think? Alright, yes, on the one hand, it does call back to that domino effect you may have heard of, and I believe we mentioned before, the idea that this ripple effect could continue throughout the entire region, but also, again, it could be used, this one in particular, could be used as a model for other countries. Because on the one hand, you only had to worry about violent areas or areas where there was a lack of prosperity. The fact that a revolution occurred like this in a place like Iran might suggest that many other countries throughout the region you might not have thought you were going to worry about were going to get involved in something like this as well. The fact that this was an Islamic Republic, of course, as you might imagine, made it even more unpopular internationally for many Western powers. The fear of Islam and Islamic empires is nothing new that we currently see today, and so the fact that you now have a government that's entirely Islamic run also seems as a threat to people in the West who are, of course, primarily not only capitalist, but also largely Christian as well. So again, very scary revolution for a lot of people that did not make Iran very popular. This helped lead to the Iranian hostage crisis. By 1979, Carter had allowed the exiled Iranian Shah of the country, who was essentially the monarch of the country supported by the US, to come to America and get asylum for cancer treatment. In response, an Iranian mob seized the US embassy in Tehran and took 53 hostages. The crisis lasted, amazingly, you might imagine, over 1 year. This crisis is also highlighted by a failed rescue attempt you can see depicted here, when 8 were killed in a combat helicopter and transport plane crash. The hostages were only released when Carter was defeated in the election of 1980. So again, how does this show maybe the legacy of the Cold War? And particularly, what is this effect going to have on Carter and maybe his replacement? Right, again, as you might imagine, and you can see here, this shows that the United States and the Soviet Union getting involved in the politics of other countries does lead to severe consequences. So again, not that you could ever justify this hostage crisis, but the fact that the United States did get involved in Iran and involved in democratic elections did lead to direct consequences and led to continuing violence long after some of the main conflicts in World War II, for example, were over. So again, this led to many long-lasting consequences and led to huge damage to Carter's reputation and the United States' reputation as well. Particularly when this rescue attempt failed in such a spectacularly embarrassing way for the nation, Carter's presidency was essentially doomed. This would, of course, lead to Carter's replacement and eventually President Ronald Reagan to take a much more aggressive stance in the Cold War, which we've already talked about a little bit and will continue to discuss throughout the rest of the semester. Now, this conflict also helped to lead to the Iran-Iraq War, which some of you who are familiar with more modern Middle Eastern conflicts might be aware of. As I mentioned, one of the fears the international community had when this Iranian Islamic government took power was that it might spread throughout the region. This fear was actually shared by the country of Iraq. The important thing to recognize about Iran and Iraq at this time is that Iraq was primarily consisted of Shiite Muslims, while Iran primarily consisted of Sunni Muslims. Well, I don't have time to get too much into the differences between these two groups, but as many of you may know, they do not typically get along throughout history and disagree with each other very strongly. Because of this, on September 22nd in 1980, the Shia majority of Iraq invaded the Sunni majority of Iran in order to prevent the Iranian Revolution and Sunni upsurge from spreading into and influencing Iraq. This war lasted until 8 years and did not end until October the 20th, 1988. Now, why do you think most international support, including from the United States, France, and the United Kingdom, went to Iraq? Why would most of that support go that way? Alright, very good. That one's pretty simple. Remember, we just mentioned the Iranian Revolution. The United States was obviously not on the side of the individuals who were supporting this revolution. They overthrew a government the United States and the United Kingdom supported. Because of this, as you might imagine, this again shows the influence of the Cold War in later conflicts. Western powers who supported capitalism and the United States wanted to overthrow this potentially pro-Soviet and Islamic government. The war was heavily characterized by chemical weapons use, primarily by Iran, which, as you can see in this picture in the far right, would eventually be used deliberately on citizens in direct violation of the Geneva Convention. The war was quite devastating and is one of the most devastating wars in world history since World War II. It is estimated that it was reported by both sides that they lost about 200,000 soldiers in deaths and about 400,000 wounded on each side. However, various outside sources have reported that potentially as many as 600,000 individuals died on each side, and the casualties are just underreported. So again, how does this maybe show the continuing influence of religious divides and again the Cold War? And what side do you think the United States should have taken in this war? Very similar to some of the African dictators we've discussed, for example. Did the United States make the right choice in supporting Iraq in this war? Again, that's not something I can really answer for you, obviously. But again, I do think it's important to point out that I do not support, of course, this chemical warfare use at all. Do just want to be clear on that. But again, I do just think this conflict helps to show the lingering influence of the Cold War. As various countries start getting involved in affecting other countries' politics, the resulting conflicts can continue for many years after the initial involvement. So after the United States and the United Kingdom got involved in Iran for the first time in the 1950s, this conflict is still continuing well into the 1980s, and really is continuing still to this day, which we will talk about before the end of the semester. But in the meantime, this conflict also directly led into the 1973 oil crisis, which affected a huge portion of the world. In 1973, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, also known as OPEC, mainly halted all their oil exports to America, Japan, Canada, the UK, and the Netherlands in protest of their support of Israel in the October War. To very quickly summarize this war, which is also known as the Yom Kippur War, an Arab coalition led by Egypt and Syria wanted to reclaim the Israeli-occupied region of Sinai. Israel was backed by the US and Western powers, and Egypt especially was backed by the USSR. So again, these Cold War countries are instead of directly fighting each other, supporting various other countries in these proxy wars. Israel was, of course, victorious, but Arab countries did retaliate against the countries that supported Israel. By March of 1974, oil prices had rose by about 300% internationally, going from about $3 to $12 per barrel. In equivalent 2018 prices, this would be an increase from $17 to $67 per barrel. Few effects internationally. In 1974, the Emergency Highway Energy Conservation Act was passed, which limited the nationwide miles per hour limit to 55 miles per hour. Japan switched from focusing on oil industries and oil-related production to electronics, which could have helped cause the creation of Nintendo, which I'm sure a few nerds in here like myself enjoy, and various other tech companies and tech productions Japan is famous for. Also, the international demand for large automobiles went down, and automobiles with smaller engines that required less oil became much more popular. Now, to close things off, we're going to look at the Cold War in Afghanistan, which, as you can probably see in this top right picture right here, is one of the best examples of the long-standing impacts of international involvement in the Middle East. From this involvement of the foreign powers in Afghanistan started with the Soviet-Afghan War of 1979 through 1989. In this war, Islamic guerrilla fighters known as the Mujahideen were supported by the United States, the UK, and Saudi Arabia in their war against the Afghan Republic, which was backed by the USSR. This war was started in response to a Soviet-backed coup in which the president at the time, Hafizullah Amin, which I'm probably mispronouncing, was killed. One of the most important aspects to remember of this conflict is that the former Mujahideen did eventually include future terrorists such as Osama bin Laden. As you might imagine, and as you can see here, the United States and other countries were directly involved in supplying these Mujahideen troops. These troops who were originally allied with the United States against the Soviet Union, many of them would eventually turn on them, obviously including Osama bin Laden. We'll talk a little bit about why that happened in a couple of weeks, but it is important to recognize, whatever your feelings on it, that the United States was directly involved in supplying these individuals who would later turn around to attack them. So again, obviously a very important example of how this international involvement can impact history later down the road. The UN also during this time voted to condemn Soviet involvement in the war, and the US boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics. By February 15, 1989, US and UK and Saudi Arabian intervention was successful. The Soviet troops began to withdraw as the USSR began to decline overall, and the rebels were successful in completely kicking them out by 1992. So again, we'll go talk about a little bit more detail about the USSR decline as well, but the lingering impact as well of the United States support and involvement in Afghanistan. But in the meantime, again, think a little more about why these actions are going to become significant later. But in the meantime, that's all I really have for you today. Just keep these upcoming assignments in mind and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.